3 here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukemar.
What's going on?
And we are your number one source of struggle, socialism, and soul. And today is Friday, June 21st, 2024. It's a lovely evening here in Washington, D.C. Jackie, how you feeling?
It's not lovely, Sean. It's 101 degrees outside. That's not lovely. That's a dress rehearsal for the apocalypse. But other than that, I'm feeling really good. It really is a good day today. So how are you doing? How are you this Friday?
Everything's cool. Everything's cool. I mean, you're right. It is particularly hot here in DC, but that is lovely to me. You know what I'm saying? I'm a Floridian. So
well, you're from Florida where roaches fly. Yeah. I don't.
Well, a lot of things fly down there. There's some real critters down by where I'm from. And the heat here in DC can be brutal, but I far prefer it to winter. Jackie, today, of course, as I say, is June 21st. We're in a time that's very relevant historically. Of course, this week marked Juneteenth, which something that became a federal holiday in recent years. And, what I tend to think was maybe a kind of cynical and ham-fisted thing on behalf of the White House, but I think still very relevant both for its history and its ongoing relevance for Black struggle. And also even today marks 60 years since the murder of the civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was one of the major events in the history in the struggle against Jim Crow apartheid here in the United States. And I wanted to bring that all together with some more relevant history with our guest for today, Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston and the author of dozens of books, including the new piece, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Horne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And Dr. Horne, I wanted to begin our conversation today by talking about your new book, Armed Struggle, through what is really a crucial period in the political history of the United States, especially as it pertains to the Black liberation struggle. And so just to begin, just to ask sort of broadly, I'm curious why you wanted to publish this book now, and how do you see it as resonating with the history we're sort of grappling with on today?
Well, first of all, in this book, which can be found in better bookstores everywhere, I draw a distinction between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Armed propaganda reflected in May 1967 when the newly minted Black Panther Party marched into the state legislature in Sacramento, California, armed in opposition to certain legislation that they objected to. Armed self-defense, referring in other words to incidents like what happened in Los Angeles in December 1969 when the LAPD assaulted the Panther headquarters, contemplated bringing tanks up from a military base south of Los Angeles, north of San Diego. An armed struggle reflected in August 1970 when the Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson assaulted the courthouse in Marin County, California, north of San Francisco, in an apparent attempt to free his imprisoned brother. Speaking of George Jackson, who, as you know, was then slain under murky circumstances the following year. Now, I talk about these issues because oftentimes when talking about the retreat of Jim Crow apartheid, to use the phrase you just used, oftentimes it's spoken of exclusively in terms of passive nonviolent resistance. And certainly that particular approach was quite useful, but it was not the only approach of the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, if you look at the broad history of the Black liberation struggle, going back to Nat Turner in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, John Brown, 1859 in Harper's Ferry, then Virginia, now West Virginia, the attempt by the Communist Party to be trained in Moscow in the 1930s and various techniques of armed struggle. This question of armed struggle, armed self-defense, and armed propaganda has a lengthy genealogy that oftentimes is swept under the rug. And one of the things, too, I wanted to bring out from the shadows is the fact that in talking about the Black liberation movement, and this should be particularly relevant to this show and your audience, what happens is that oftentimes the ideological differences that obtain between, for example, the Panthers, many of the leaders deeply influenced by the Socialist Project, Jonathan Jackson, the aforementioned teenager who led the charge against the Marin County Courthouse, he published a newsletter at his Pasadena high school called Iskra, in homage to the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, many of the Panthers were deeply influenced by socialist ideology. But when historians, many of whom are not influenced by socialist ideology, come to write about this era, that's swept under the rug. They're all grouped under this rubric of Black power, which oftentimes has under the same rubric people who they disagreed with sharply on an ideological basis. So these are some of the issues I'm grappling with in this book, which has just been published.
So, Dr. Horne, I really like the fact that this book is out now at this particular point in history, like Sean pointed out, because we meaning organizers, we are usually in our organizing spaces having conversations about the historical significance of this moment in history. And then someone always brings up the idea or the issue of armed struggle, but it's not in like the historical context of what does the history of armed struggle among oppressed people mean for us now. Usually it's in a kind of like a litmus test almost when the question is asked, what are you all's position on armed struggle? And it's framed in like a fear that, I really hope you guys are not for armed struggle. How do you see us contending with what looks and feels to me like a fear of even really talking honestly about the role armed struggle has played in the long history of liberation struggle for Africans in this country and abroad, up against the fact that we live in a society that is incredibly violent towards us. And it's a very weird thing that self-defense and armed struggle are like these things that are taboo still among the people who are oppressed.
Well, I think it may have something to do with the fact, and I try to make this point in the text, that I think one of the flaws in the approach to armed struggle in the 60s and 70s was a misestimation of the objective conditions that would facilitate armed struggle. I mean, for example, people looked at Cuba pre-1959, they looked at Mozambique, Angola, they saw that those comrades had picked up the gun, and they thought perhaps automatically that they could do the same, irrespective of the differing conditions on these battlefields. And then there's a misestimation of the United States of America, which has something to do, I'm afraid to say, with our friends on the left, who to this very day have not seemed to have figured out that we are living in a settler colonial society. Now, what's happened since the campus encampments around Gaza and Palestine is that the term settler colonialism has barged its way into the contemporary vocabulary. And fortunately, it's not only being applied to historic Palestine, to historic or to Southern Africa, for example, but increasingly it's being applied to the United States of America, which is understandable because, after all, like these other settler colonial projects, what happened is that Europeans invaded and through the barrel of a gun oppressed and or seized the land, enslaved millions of Africans, as we know in North America. But I think what's happened is that the Panthers in particular, who I pay quite a bit of attention to, I think that implicitly they did not have confidence in the bona fides of a working class struggle, not least because so much of the settler descendant working class has not been enmeshed in armed struggle, but class collaboration. I mean, that's the secret sauce of settler colonialism, class collaboration. That's one of the reasons why in South Africa, in the recent elections, the neo-apartheid party, the Democratic Alliance, got 20% of the vote. Almost all of the votes coming from descendants of settlers, for example. That's part of the explanation for January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C., where you had this motley coalition of CEOs flying in on private plane, shopkeepers, veterans, cops, the class elements, working class elements, all of whom are mostly were from settler backgrounds. A clear case of class collaboration. And I think that because of this implicit lack of confidence in working class struggle, that leads the Panthers into elevating the idea of the lumpen as being the motive force of revolutionary struggle. Now, I've done quite a bit of writing about the lumpen. I have an essay in the book, I Dare Say, the Gerald Horne Reader, on the lumpen and the role that is played transnationally. But suffice it to say that relying upon the lumpen, who could definitionally include pimps and drug dealers, etc., was not the most sound political approach. But on the other hand, once you are moving away from working class struggle, that does not leave that many alternatives. And that's part of what I deal with in this book.
Yeah, and I definitely want to touch more on the South Africa elections and some other developments on the African continent, Dr. Horne. But I want to stay for just a moment on this idea that you just raised, which I think is quite true, that class collaboration is the secret sauce of settler colonialism. And I think too often the whole class question, I think, is, too often ignored when we have these discussions. On one hand, I think perhaps on another hand, there's kind of an overemphasis on it to the detriment of other important issues. But there's another aspect of this that I wanted to touch on. And I hope I'm not getting too abstract here, but what I'm really thinking about is the impact that settler colonialism and living under that can have on the consciousness of colonized and oppressed people. And what I'm speaking to specifically is the fact that we had Juneteenth this week, as I mentioned, and there's been a lot of conversations around the appropriate flags and who is quote unquote allowed to celebrate Juneteenth. And the issue really stems from these rightist nativist elements, this rightist nativist minority amongst Black Americans that has somewhat gained some steam here in recent years, that basically thinks that we should eschew the Pan-African elements of Juneteenth that have been around for a long time, and the use of the red, black, and green flag and other sort of African iconography and symbols in that way that we've seen in Juneteenth throughout the years, and asserting that basically this should be a kind of Black patriotic holiday in a sense, almost like a Black July 4th, although the context there is really quite different. And so I'm just sort of curious how you see that aspect of it, Dr. Horne, when we talk about, the politics of memory, of an oppressed people, when we talk about the Black liberation struggle. You see what I mean?
Well, sure. And this reminds me of a frequent complaint of my own, which is that if you want to keep a secret, publish it in a book, because as you may recall, a year or so ago, I published an entire book on Texas that has an update on the roots of Juneteenth. And in order to understand Juneteenth, you have to set aside the white savior narrative as reflected in General Granger coming into Galveston, telling the enslaved Negroes, don't you people know you're free? Which is really insulting and ludicrous. When in fact, what was happening is that General Granger and Black soldiers were coming into Galveston to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation from the barrel of a gun, because the enslaving class had this diabolical idea to continue enslavement. In fact, to continue enslavement in league with French-occupied Mexico. Recall that Mexico had been occupied by France during the course of the US Civil War, and it took a joint struggle between Mexicans and Black soldiers to squash that diabolical, devilish scheme. And that, it seems to me, is part of another story of Black history that sometimes is swept under the rug in the attempt to shoehorn it into the traditional US narrative, where our liberation is solely a product of what happens in the four corners of the United States of America, as opposed to being oftentimes part of an international struggle. This one, Juneteenth, in fact, being a part of joint struggle with Mexicans against colonial occupation. Mm. And with regard to your other point, it reminds me of pastors who only talk about heaven and never talk about hell. I mean, that's what I mean with regard to talking about class struggle, never talking about class collaboration, even though we know that union density in the United States, that is to say, the level of membership in unions is one of the lowest in the capitalist world for some strange reason. And this is hardly grappled with on a materialist basis. And that flaw, it seems to me, then leads into other flaws. I mean, for example, I've made a point to mention, since the encampment movement on campuses over historic Palestine, to note that many of our friends on the left, they've invented this concept of, quote, identity politics, which oftentimes is used to defame various wings of the Black liberation movement. But I've never heard anybody on the US left refer to Israel as an exemplar of an identity politics state. Here you have a state based upon a narrow, exclusivist, ethno-religious identity. And this is the sort of thing that will have historians of the future assume that we're able to avoid nuclear holocaust, scratching their heads in bafflement, wondering, what were these people thinking about? I mean, where were their heads when all of this was going on?
And you know, Dr. Horne, I have to say, I always chuckle every time you say identity politics, the way you say it, because it is so clear that you have a lot of disdain for that term, and you should. And I think all of us who have engaged in these discussions about this issue on the left, I think we're kind of sick of the focus on it too, which is why the real history of Juneteenth is so important for us to understand what this incident, what this moment in the history of liberation struggle of Africans, and now, as you point out, involving struggle with Mexicans as well, that is important to us now. So when you talk about Granger and his forces and Black soldiers coming into Galveston to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, on the one hand, that sounds very, laudatory. It's like, yay, they came and did a good thing. But when we really read into what was said by Granger to the Africans who already knew the war was over, who already understood that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and they knew full well that they had no legal protection from punishment were they to just walk off the plantations. What was said to them that also makes the way we talk about Juneteenth really problematic in how it's been so easily co-opted by the state today?
Well, it was rather patronizing. It was rather condescending. to put it mildly. You people are going to have to work, which is quite a statement to make to people who had been dragooned into working for free for decades, if not centuries. But once again, this has to be understood in the accurate context and the true context of what was going on in the United States of America. And this is where there's been a kind of failure. I hate to sound like a broken record, but a kind of failure on the part of our friends on the left, because there's been a lot of literature, a lot of historiography in recent years trying to right these historical wrongs and to try to present an accurate record, for example. But what oftentimes happens is that these histories do not penetrate beyond the historian's guilt. And so just as you would be reluctant to hire a lawyer who's not keeping up with Supreme Court decisions and Federal Court of Appeals decisions and district court opinions, et cetera, or you'd be reluctant to visit a physician who's not au courant with the New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet out of Britain, you have people who consider themselves to be scientists of society, revolutionaries, but they don't keep up with the literature. they don't understand, for example, that historians, at least many of the progressive historians, minimally, are now very critical of the Constitution, for example. I think, and this is coming out of elite institutions. I think of Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School, his book, The Broken Constitution, or Assis Rana, who published this 900-page book recently with University of Chicago Press, The Constitutional Bind. We see critiques of this concept of anti-slavery, which on the one hand sounds positive, but we now know that anti-slavery, for example, in Oregon in the 1850s, if not Vermont in the 1770s, meant no Negroes allowed, be they enslaved or free, for example. Lerone Bennett, the late Lerone Bennett of Ebony magazine, got into hot water when he published a book a few years ago upbraiding Abraham Lincoln, for example. Since Abraham Lincoln, for a good deal of his tenure in the White House, believed in emancipation, then colonization. He even had the temerity to invite some Black leaders to the White House in the midst of the US Civil War, trying to entice and encourage them to leave. Now, of course, this book by Lerone Bennett is not considered to be controversial, although I recall at the time when it came out some years ago, he was upbraided and denounced. You can find it on C-SPAN by many mainstream historians who preferred mythology as opposed to historical objectivity and accuracy. But what's happening is that there's this split right now with regard to our understanding of the United States of America. But unfortunately, many of the left, they prefer the old time religion. They prefer what they learned in political education class maybe a decade or two ago. They remind me of the cliche about the professor who comes into lecture with his yellow lecture notes that have not been updated in the slightest. And what this means is that objectively, they're on the side of the right wing. They're on the side of you mentioned Florida, of Governor DeSantis and his comrades who have talked about slavery not being altogether negative because supposedly people could learn skills during slavery. Or in Texas, where you have high school principals being routed and losing their jobs because of trying to teach an accurate story about history and about Black history in particular. And so this is the moment that we're faced with, but I'm confident that we can overcome these formidable barriers.
Yeah, and for those who are curious, that book by Lerone Bennett that Dr. Horne is referring to is Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. And yeah, I definitely remember as a kid, my mother had a subscription to Ebony and Essence. And, I distinctly remember flipping through the pages of Ebony and seeing that book being advertised and being curious about it. And Doctor, I wanted to switch gears a little bit to swing back to the recent elections in South Africa. And I mean, we're talking about, 30 years since the first democratic elections in 1994, with, there's really happening at what I think is a real inflection point politically for South Africa. There was something of a collapse in the vote of the ANC, the ruling African National Congress. And you mentioned a little earlier sort of the advance of the different right-wing parties in South Africa. And so, Dr. Horne, I was hoping you could help us make sense of the results of the South Africa elections and what it tells us about politics inside the country right now.
Well, as you suggested, the vote total of the dominant ANC, which is still the leading party, it fell from about 57% to 40%. The neo-apartheid Democratic Alliance is now in a coalition government with the ANC. We should not try to deodorize or sanitize that result. It's certainly a setback for those who believe in uprooting the vestiges of apartheid and moving towards wealth redistribution and or socialism. But it's important also to understand how and why this happened. And I would point to a number of factors. When the African National Congress and forces to the left were unbanned, it took place in February 1990, a few months after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, a year or so before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the retreat of socialism in Europe. And of course, these forces were the primary backstop for the ANC. As I point out in my book on the topic, the last apartheid leader, F.W. de Klerk, precisely chose that moment to release Mandela and his comrades, figuring that they would be handicapped in terms of negotiations, and that turned out to be accurate. There was a compromise agreement leading to elections in 1994. And recall, it was in the midst of intense violence, not only violence unleashed on the part of the settlers, but Zulu chauvinist violence, as reflected in what is now the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is also part of this 2024 coalition with the African National Congress. But having said that, another turning point comes, I'm afraid to say, with the internal coup that leads to the ascension of the third president of Free South Africa, speaking of Jacob Zuma, circa 2008. He replaced Thabo Mbeki, and of course, there are reasons to be critical of the Mbeki regime, not least with regard to HIV/AIDS policy. But at the same time, in the cold light of history, we can see that the rise of Jacob Zuma serving in power for about a decade was disastrous. It was catastrophic. It led to what an official investigation called state capture. Mr. Zuma has sticky fingers, and many of his comrades did as well. And then when he was dislodged, circa 2018, circa 2019, and of course, he's still facing numerous criminal charges. In 2021, he and his comrades unleashed violence in Durban, their headquarters on the Indian Ocean coast, which is also a citadel of Zulu strength. And by the way, Mr. Zuma has unveiled himself as something of a Zulu chauvinist and a Zulu nationalist, and hundreds of people were killed. And he's threatening the same again if he does not get his way, because he's still facing criminal charges. And so, as some commentators have suggested, if you look at the figures, 40% for the ANC, Mr. Zuma's party, which ran in this election, the MK party, they got about 14 or 15%. The Economic Freedom Fighters, which is also a split off from the ANC, Julius Malema, the leader, was formerly a leader of the ANC Youth League. He, of course, led the charge on behalf of Jacob Zuma back in the day, saying that he would kill for Jacob Zuma. His party got about 9%. So if you add up all those totals, 40 plus 14, 54 plus 9, 63, you're basically seeing the ANC majority. but it's been split. And I dare say that it would not surprise me at all if there's another split, because there's a lot of discontent about this coalition with the neo-apartheid Democratic Alliance Party, which, by the way, we should not sweep this under the rug. We should not downplay the fact that it's disproportionately comprised of descendants of settlers across class lines. And once again, that kind of class collaboration should not necessarily be unfamiliar to those of us in the United States of America, because you cannot begin to understand January 6, 2021, nor the Trump coalition without understanding class collaboration, which inherits in settler colonialism. So that's my 3 cents with regard to Southern Africa.
Well, I'm hoping you have a few more cents, Dr. Horne, because I'm very curious about the seeming collapse. I don't know if that's the right word, but the poor showing of the economic freedom fighters in this election. And it seemed to be a shock to them. And it was certainly a shock to me, because I've been following them, and we've seen the videos of the enormous rallies that they had in stadium after stadium after stadium across South Africa. What happened to the EFF? Why were they not able to make better inroads in this election, even if they weren't expected to win? Right? Let's be clear about that.
Well, Mr. Malema himself suggested in a post-election autopsy that Mr. Zuma's MK party, to a degree, stole their thunder. That is to say, those who were concerned about the trajectory of the ANC, those who thought that the ANC should have been more vigorous with regard to land redistribution, for example, or nationalizing the commanding heights of the economy. And by the way, some are wondering why Mr. Zuma, when he was president, was not more vigorous in that regard, but that's another story for another day. And so Zuma's party stole the thunder of the EFF. And then, of course, Mr. Malema, he has his own problems. He's been accused of corruption himself, like Mr. Zuma. And then there was a lot of propaganda in South Africa about the alleged negative example of Zimbabwe. What I mean by that is, recall that some years ago, under the leadership of the ruling party, ZANU-PF, there was land reform, there was land redistribution. The North Atlantic countries, led by the United States and Great Britain, were up in arms, slapping sanctions on Zimbabwe. To a degree, those sanctions have not been lifted, although recently the United States sought to tighten sanctions against the leaders and lift them against the country, I would argue, because Zimbabwe is a storehouse of lithium, which Elon Musk and others see as a license to print money because it's essential to the green economy. And so the negative propaganda was that if the South African regime pursued the same path as Zimbabwe, as Mr. Malema was suggesting, they would face the fate of Zimbabwe, which had world-class inflation. The sanctions really bit deeply. ZANU-PF has been able to hang on to power, but that propaganda was very potent. But we should also take a step back and try to ascertain what's going on regionally as well, because we know that when South Africa came to liberation in 1994, it was not only because of what was happening within the four corners of that country. There were the frontline states, there was the role of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. And with regard to the region, what's happening is that the United States is very upset with South Africa because you're dragging US ally Israel before the International Court of Justice because of its role in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, because of South Africa's unwillingness to detain then Sudanese leader, President al-Bashir, when he was passing through South Africa. And so therefore, Washington is seeking leverage against South Africa by seeking to gain influence, for example, in Angola. Anthony Blinken has visited Angola, for example. There's even been talk, believe it or not, between the militaries of these two countries. As noted, the sanctions against the nation of Zimbabwe have been loosened. I dare say that has something to do with trying to gain leverage against South Africa. And then in Mozambique, of course, there's this religious insurgency in the north, which has really destabilized the country. And needless to say, US allies, particularly the Gulf Arab states, have a hand in that regard, and that's softening up Mozambique to perhaps be used as some sort of cudgel against South Africa. So it's a very complex scenario and tableau that we're facing in that part of Africa. And I would urge and caution our friends and comrades to pay attention to this and certainly keep up the pressure on the US State Department, which as ever is playing a malignant and a malign role in that part of Africa.
For sure. And moving for a moment from South Africa to East Africa, Doctor, I wanted to discuss the recent protests that have been happening across Kenya in a movement that some have dubbed the Occupy Parliament movement. That is, among other things, basically aimed against the Ruto government's plans to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes. And I believe just this past week, there was at least 200 people injured and one person killed in protests across the country, which was met with police repression and things like this. And of course, this is happening as, Kenya is preparing to take part, basically act as the black face of yet another invasion of Haiti. And so I'm wondering what you make of these protests in Kenya, Dr. Horne, and sort of why we've been seeing the Kenyan government sort of maneuvering in the way it's been lately.
Well, I think President Ruto perhaps has overstepped his boundaries, has misinterpreted what he perceived to be a mandate when he attained that upset victory in presidential elections. Recall that he was not necessarily by his predecessor, Uhuru Kenyatta, a son of founding father, Jomo Kenyatta. And I think that there is upset amongst the poor and working class in Kenya, not only in Nairobi, but Mombasa and throughout the country, because of these extensive taxes that Mr. Ruto is trying to impose, even taxes on women's sanitary products, for example, which really was rejected widely. And I think there's also upset, as your latter comment suggests, with regard to Nairobi being a kind of deputy sheriff for US imperialism, not only in the sub-region, but stretching into the Caribbean, stretching into Haiti, which is one of the reasons why, in an extraordinary manner, just a few weeks ago, he was entertained at the White House at a state dinner. The last state dinner for an African leader was 15 or 16 years ago, for example. And that underscored this ever closer relationship between Nairobi and Washington. But I would suggest that the president watches back, not only because of these protests, which have garnered international coverage, but the United States believes that its partners should be monogamous, although it engages in polygamy. What I mean by that strained metaphor is that at the same time, Nairobi is courting favor with Washington. It's also courting favor with Beijing. Beijing has poured substantial capital into Kenya, particularly in terms of building railways. And as the saying goes in Africa nowadays, when Chinese envoys show up, they want to talk about trade and upgrading relations. When US envoys show up, they want to talk about China. And the United States, as I say, is a very jealous partner. And it would not be surprising if the old US strategy of a double game, which is their stock and trade, recall that this is how they played Mozambique for years after Mozambican independence in 1975. On the one hand, supposedly having cordial diplomatic relations. On the other hand, working with various contra forces to destabilize the regime. So I hope I'm not talking out of school when I suggest that the current president of Kenya might not necessarily have a lengthy term in office, but it won't necessarily be because of these raucous protests, which are now rocking Nairobi.
And of course, Dr. Horne, for people who have been watching the impending invasion of Haiti that you've brought up, that Kenya is also involved in, which is interesting considering the internal problems they're having. And this is something that has been brought up in the context of Kenya's potential leading this armed military, it's an invasion, into Haiti. With its police force, a police force that we're just talking about has unleashed this unconscionable violence on its own people, and that's their reputation. So what does this these problems, these new problems with these tax reforms that are causing people to come out into the streets and protest Ruto, what impact do you think this will have on the situation in Haiti that Kenya is, they're the tip of the spear for, at least on behalf of the imperialist forces?
Well, as I'm sure you and your audience recognize, it's not just Kenya that's volunteered at the behest of the so-called core group, including the United States, Canada, and France, for this fool's errand in Haiti. Apparently, Jamaica has stepped forward. Apparently, Barbados has stepped forward, Bangladesh, Chad, etc. The problem is that in civil society in Haiti, there's quite a bit of skepticism, to put it mildly, with regard to these international forces. Recall the last international brigades that showed up in Haiti, they left quite a bit of wreckage behind in terms of spreading of disease, in terms of sexual abuse of young women. I'm afraid to say that there is no guarantee that that dastardly history will not be repeated. And so I think that President Ruto, if I can read his mind, may be rethinking the dispatching of these police forces to the Caribbean, because he'll need all the police forces that he can muster to deal with his own people. Because as I said, these protests, they're not just in Nairobi, they're not just in Mombasa, they've broken out across the country. And that in itself might lead to the staying of his hand.
Yeah, and I feel like we're seeing a number of relevant things sort of unfold here. I mean, when we see the contradictions happening inside Kenya, as we see Ruto's decision to go along with this planned invasion by U.S. imperialism, and the fact that U.S. imperialism even feels the need to position Kenya in that way. I mean, what do you think that tells us, Dr. Horne, about kind of the state of U.S. imperialism, not just in Haiti, but I think in any number of areas that we can point to, when this system, which still is very much the hegemonic power on the earth, when it feels the need to even have a veneer of deniability when it comes to war crimes. What do we think that says about kind of the state of the imperialist system?
Well, if you look at it historically, it's easy to see that this small planet in recent decades moved from a kind of bipolarity. That is to say, the United States versus the socialist camp led by the Soviet Union, in league with national liberation movements. And then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which led to a so-called unipolar world, a unipolar moment, with the United States as supposedly the sole remaining superpower, as used to be boasted, with the dollar being hegemonic, for example, with the United States running roughshod over Iraq for example, in 2003, amongst other crimes against humanity. And now, as evidentiary of the increasing decline and crisis of US imperialism, even mainstream commentators, even bourgeois commentators, for example, in the Financial Times of London, speak of a multipolar world. That is to say, from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity, with a number of powers, the United States imperialism being only one, the EU, China, Russia, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which the United States takes particular exception to. And if US imperialism is not careful, the next stage, and I will not disagree if some see this as inevitable, the next stage will be another unipolar world, except that it'll be China-centric, for example. Because what happened, and oftentimes our commentators have neglected to assess this factor, that one of the key factors leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union was the deal made a half century ago between China and the United States on an anti-Soviet basis, which led to this massive foreign direct investment into China, which has created this juggernaut. Interestingly enough, a key figure in this process was a former leader of the United Auto Workers, Leonard Woodcock, who became US ambassador to China and helped to shepherd the movement of manufacturing plants across the Pacific to the benefit of the Chinese economy, perhaps to the detriment of the US economy. And as we see, the current issue of The Economist, the British conservative weekly that's out in your newsstands right now, they talk about China surging to the forefront in terms of science, material science, physics, chemistry, exploring the dark side of the moon, to use that colloquial term, willing to subsidize the entire planet with regard to green energy, which the United States is objecting to, despite the fact that it would seem to be a kind of gift to the United States of America. But the United States doesn't see it that way. They would see that as more power to Beijing. And of course, the United States has not been reclining recumbent in the face of this Chinese challenge. You see that they've unleashed their attack dog in the Philippines against China. They're bolstering the so-called defenses of Taiwan, which they're trying to turn into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Japan, part of the US cabal, is the number 3 military spender behind the United States and China. And of course, that military spending is directed principally at the People's Republic. But alas, events are moving forward at warp speed, because we just witnessed the visit of President Putin to both North Korea and to Vietnam. And the former visit will be of significance, particularly with regard to North Korea being able to restrain the aggressive impulses in Japan and its neighbor to the south, speaking of South Korea. So US imperialism, Sean, to answer your question, is facing multiple crises. And it's unclear if this election in November will resolve this crisis, although I dare say that it won't. And in fact, depending on the results, could actually exacerbate this crisis.
That's absolutely true. And as much as we celebrate the obvious and clearly advancing end of at least hegemonic U.S. imperialism and this bipolarity or unipolarity, really, which is what it's been for many years, and we're embracing and celebrating this multipolarity, it also means we're in a very dangerous and fraught moment of time as we're traversing, the transition from one system to another, or from one global arrangement to another. What does this mean in regard to the other existential crises we're facing, which is climate change? It's all happening at once, Dr. Horne. I mean, there are water protests in Algeria. It is 100 degrees in June in Washington, D.C. It is broiling in Boston. It is, I mean, how do we fight all of this at once and not lose our minds?
Well, that's the $64 question. But once again, I would return to this effort by China to pioneer in green energy. And rather than looking a gift horse in the mouth, which is what the United States is doing, seeking to bar the export of solar panels from China into the US market, and then twisting the arms of so-called US allies to do the same. If you look at the recent G7 communique, the group of seven, the United States, Canada, the Western Europeans, and Japan, a meeting in Italy, in their final communique, China was mentioned about 25 times. Now, to be sure, I don't necessarily expect the kind of unity of the imperialist bloc vis-a-vis China that was exemplified during the latter stages of the Cold War against the Soviet Union, when they were certainly marching in lockstep. I mean, for example, President Xi Jinping of China was just in France just before this Italian summit. Chancellor Scholz of Berlin, ditto. The neo-fascist Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, who, by the way, was being courted in the Oval Office in July 2023, despite the fact that she heads the most anti-African regime in Europe, perhaps on planet Earth. And despite all of this talk in our community about global white supremacy, I don't recall any protests as she was being courted and embraced literally by President Biden. So I think that with regard to these multiple crises that we face, historically in most countries, the way it's dealt with is having a militant opposition party with caucuses that have portfolios dealing with these pressing issues, be it climate change, be it the migration question, be it the racist terror, police terror, etc. But once again, if you return to the bipolar moment, when as a result of this vigorous anti-communism, the United States forced the left to throw overboard, forced the mass organizations like the NAACP, for example, to throw overboard its left wing and to attack folks like Paul Robeson, for example. The labor movement was forced to do the same. And we have yet to recover from those crushing blows during the bipolar moment, speaking of the Red Scare. But if somehow we're going to be able to overcome these current and pressing crises of the moment, we're going to have to try to figure out a way to recreate what we lost during the bipolar moment.
Yeah, and you know, Jackie, I feel like what Dr. Horne's saying is so right. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily have an appreciation for just how profound the repression was against the different social movements in the United States in this period. But the fact that here lately in recent years, I mean, we've seen the movement for Palestine, the movement against racist police terror, the movement for LGBTQ rights, the movement for abortion rights and women's liberation, the climate struggle. There have been a number of progressive people's movements that have been springing up and not only have been operating, but have been sustaining themselves. I mean, I would argue that a big part of what has been sustaining the Palestine protests in the U.S. was sort of a lot of the same energy that was carried over sort of from 2020 from the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, those reference points and those connections have never been lost.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so I think as ever, the answer to all of the pressing issues facing humanity right now is to be organized.
Mm-hmm.
And because when we look at the capitalist class, the ruling class, the forces and institutions that are responsible for so much suffering of humanity right now, we're talking about an element that is highly organized, highly structured, and highly class conscious, and really is willing to stop at nothing in order to continue to have a society that's designed for their benefit. Well, we'll have to meet that level of organization with organization. And I stress this to people all the time because there's this idea among some in the movement that the less organized something is, or the less structured something is, and that somehow makes it more democratic. But this is backwards thinking. We have to be very intentional about the kind of organizations that we are building and what it is that we seek to achieve with them. And if we take a serious look at all these issues facing both us and much of humanity right now, then I think the urgency becomes clear. But that's going to do it for today here on Darker Than Blue on WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C. Want to thank Dr. Gerald Horne so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Peace.
Peace. Greetings, everyone. Greetings. Thank you so much for joining us, for staying with us. I'm Jackie Lupman, and welcome to a new episode of Blackonomically Speaking with the People's Economist, Dr. Linwood Tauheed. So good to have you back, Dr. Tauheed. How are you?
I'm doing well, and it's good to be back, and it's good to see that you are looking well.
Thank you. I'm working on it.
Good.
I'm trying not to be as stubborn as I usually am, but I'm working on it. So I'm so glad that we are back talking about Black economics because, this story broke last week, and I really just want to give it as much time as we can because it's a big story and a lot is connected to it. And I know you have a lot to say about it, Dr. Tauheed, and a lot of other things. So I just want to get into this. So Chiquita bananas, we talked about this on the morning show this past Wednesday or Thursday. Tuesday or Wednesday. I think it was Tuesday. No, it was Wednesday. It was Women's Wednesday. And let me pull up the correct story to make sure I have it for you. Where did it go? There it is. So this story we talked a little bit about Wednesday. A Florida jury found Chiquita Brands liable for the deaths of Colombian people who were working on their banana plantations. And Chiquita Brands have been made to pay $38.3 million to family members. Now, first, I think we have to make it clear that $38.3 million for, I think it was 16 people. Yeah. $38.3 million for the deaths of 16 people who worked for literally the Chiquita banana plantation. That's pocket change. That $38.3 million is literally, jeans lint for Chiquita Brands. It's nothing. Are they going to pay it? Of course not. They're going to try to appeal it and drag it out for as long as they can. It doesn't matter that that's a little bit of money for them. It's the precedent that this ruling sets for what I want to talk about tonight, which is the colonization of food and how it has cost us and how it still costs us. And I thought, Dr. Tauheed, this story about Chiquita banana or Chiquita Brands. See, we think of Chiquita as soon as we think of banana. That's how deep the relationship is between this company, which used to be called United Fruit Company, and a breakfast food that before United Fruit Company got involved in colonizing food that was grown in another country that it was also not a staple food, we would have never started eating bananas for breakfast. This is almost, it almost seems to me, Dr. Tauheed, like this whole story of the colonization of food through a company like United Fruit or slash Chiquita Brands. It almost sounds like the creation of the 1 to 2 carat diamond for an engagement ring propaganda that the De Beers company thought up. That was the reason people buy diamond rings for an engagement for marriage is because of a marketing campaign that was created by the De Beers company. Before then, nobody gave a damn what kind of ring you got for, as long as it was either gold or silver, and you actually went along and got married. But that this sounds a lot like that to me, and I want to look at a couple of things in this article, because we didn't get deep into it on Wednesday. So after the verdict, which people have said that verdict sends a powerful message to corporations everywhere, profiting from human rights abuses will not go unpunished. These families victimized by armed groups and corporation, and let's be clear, these are not two separate entities, the armed groups and the corporations. The corporation, Chiquita Brands, is paying the armed groups, okay, asserted their power and prevailed in the judicial process. And that is from Marco Simons, Earth Rights International General Counsel, and one of the plaintiff's lawyers. Chiquita Brand says the situation in Colombia was tragic for so many. This is what Chiquita Brand says, whose banana operations are based in Florida, said in a statement after the verdict. However, that does not change our belief that there is no legal basis for these claims. Well, according to the court documents, Chiquita paid the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known by its Spanish acronym AUC. What did I tell you about the company paying the armed group? About $1.7 million between 1997 and 2004. The AUC is blamed for the killings of thousands of people during those years. So we're not talking about like industrial machine accidents, deaths in the process of producing or harvesting or shipping product. No, this is armed militia. The armed militia of Chiquita Brands was killing people who were opposing the way they were being treated by the company. Chiquita has insisted that its Colombia subsidiary Banadex only made the payments out of fear that AUC would harm its employees and operations, court records show. Come now. Reacting to the ruling on social media, Colombian President Gustavo Petro questioned why the U.S. justice system could determine Chiquita financed paramilitary groups while judges in Colombia have not ruled against the company. That's going to have to be a whole nother conversation right there. We don't even have time to get into Gustavo Petro in this comment right here, but we will. The 2016 peace deal calls for the creation of a tribunal that will disclose judicial truths. Why don't we have one? Petro posted on X, referencing the year the civil conflict ended. Okay, so this, as we talked about Wednesday, is connected to the long involvement of United Fruit Company's involvement in South and Central America, in their settler colonialism of those countries, in their theft of land, in implementing or establishing plantations, literal plantations in South American countries, working the peasant population practically to death, and as we see, killing them when they rise up against their brutal conditions. This has been going on not since 1997, as this lawsuit claims. This has been going on by United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Brands, since the 1940s. And as we talked about Wednesday, this settlement is the first time that any U.S. company involved in this type of settler colonialism and the colonization of food has ever been held accountable for any of the crimes associated therewith. So, what do you think about the impact of this ruling and what it really exposes about how much we don't understand about the connection between the food we eat in this country that we are not indigenous to, right? The food that
Mhm.
we eat is not indigenous to this country, a lot of food. But then also, what we don't know about the history of colonization, settler colonialism, white supremacy in general, and how we don't understand we still suffer from the economic impacts of those policies, even with something as kind of ubiquitous as what we put on our plates.
Mhm. Yes, when you raised this topic as a topic of discussion, some days ago, I began to do some research and began to pull some things together that I had already known about, but hadn't pulled it together.
Mm,
Chiquita brand is, as you say, a company that is now known as Chiquita, that was known as United Fruit. And with that understanding that we're talking about United Fruit, then it raises some additional some information that is important. At some point, I want to share my screen here, if
okay.
that's possible.
Yes.
Let me see if I can do that.
Okay. Do you see the present button at the bottom?
I do, and let me see if I can. Hmm, oh, entire screen. Yeah. Okay. There it is. And I think I can share this if you're seeing this, right?
And let me pop it up there. There
Yeah,
we go.
here it is. Okay, okay. And so I want to read this a
Oh,
portion
I know what that
in the
is.
book. You know where this is
Oh,
from?
yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it starts off. This is a quote. It says, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that time, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." Says, "I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place in the nationals for the national city bank boys to collect revenue in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents." That's from a book, and many of your persons on listening may know this is from a book titled "War is a Racket" by Smedley Butler, Marine Corps Major General. He published this book in 1937. After he had retired from the Marine Corps and had done all the things that he listed here. Now, when he talks about, of course, American fruit companies in 1903, he is talking about United Fruit.
Right.
And the United Fruit Company began its process of colonization of various countries in South America. He mentions Honduras here, but we can go to Guatemala and now Colombia and other countries in South America and also in the Caribbean, including Cuba, and other Caribbean countries were under the control, or at least if not totally, if not partially, sometimes totally, under the control of United Fruit Company, which is now, of course, changed its name to Chiquita. And so this process of American corporations colonizing food in this hemisphere goes back over 100 years. And it is not just a business of, well, doing business, helping the peasants in these countries to have jobs, to be able to produce a product that can be sold to the north, and for a profitability for companies, but also income for peasant farmers. It is a process of as you use the term, plantation. This is plantation management. And these countries were turned into plantations for the benefit of the North, of American corporations. Among them is United Fruit, but there's a list of companies here, the Brown Brothers and Standard Oil and so forth. All of this is part of a process of using the military as the tip of the spear to colonize these countries. And then after World War II, we'll talk about this, after World War II, the process started of these companies raising their own private armies in these countries and paying them to suppress the population, to suppress the revolt. Many of these entities, these private armies, were supposedly armies that were expressing communist or other kinds of ideologies. They were supposedly fighting for the people, but they were being used by these corporations to suppress the people in these countries.
Wait, hold on. I'm confused there. So some of the militia that were used by these corporations were communists?
Well, they were ostensibly communist. They were supposedly against the current governments in those countries.
Ah, okay, I see what you mean.
And the current governments in those countries were lackeys for Western U.S. interests.
Mm-hmm.
And these organizations were supposedly fighting against these governments, but in fact were on the payroll of these corporations, mm-hmm. and not really fighting against the government. Mm-hmm. And so we find this process. This is after World War II, when the Cold War begins, and it became profitable for U.S. interests to create false flag organizations, if you will, in these countries to maintain the mayhem. And it comes after World War II because of the creation of the CIA. And we can talk about a couple of persons who were involved in that process, one of which was the then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, mm-hmm. and then his brother, who was Allen Dulles, CIA director, who were on the boards of United Fruit Companies, now Chiquita Band. And in this case, they engaged in a coup in 1954 to overthrow the democratically elected government president of Guatemala. Mm-hmm. And they used supposedly communist fronts to overthrow that government, that democratically elected government. The Dulles brothers have a very interesting history. We don't have time to talk about it now. But Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director, was involved in the Bay of Pigs incidents during the Kennedy administration, and he essentially disobeyed President Kennedy's orders to stand down, to not to engage in this Bay of Pigs process, and Kennedy fired him. And some believe that it was that process and that led to Kennedy's assassination.
Wow.
But that's another story.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the militias in Guatemala, because the democratically elected leader who was overthrown by those alleged communist forces, and this dovetails so nicely into the conversation we just ended on Darker Than Blue with Dr. Gerald Horne, where he talked about class collaboration with the ruling class
Right.
among the working class, right? And this is a big problem among the left that we don't talk about, that we need to. So when Dr. Tauheed is talking about these alleged communist groups that were supposed to be fighting against the current government, well, in Guatemala's case, we have Jacobo Arbenz, who was, I mean, I don't know if he called himself explicitly a socialist, but he was going to do all of the socialist things. Land redistribution, nationalization of these companies, United Fruit being the largest of them, redistribution of all of the socialist things. So he had to be gone. So if these groups were truly communist, why would they take part in overthrowing a socialist? It's because they were class collaborators with the ruling class. So we have to stop paying attention so much to what people call themselves. We need to pay attention to what people do, quite literally, which side of the barricade they're on. So I just had to make that point, Dr. Tauheed.
Yes, it I mean, the CIA's mission is deception, and so you can't you can't count up the friends and enemies by who is on the friends and enemies list of the CIA.
No.
Because they're part of their mission, part of their operating principles, is to make things appear to be not what they are.
And their friends and enemies are interchangeable,
yeah,
depending on the day of the week and the value of the dollar, quite honestly.
that's right. That's right. And so you're right. I did hear the end of Dr. Horne's discussion, and we have to raise our level of sophistication when we are dealing with. I mean, it's fairly obvious when you get to a. I mean, when you get to a Trump versus Biden situation, then it's very transparent. We can understand that both of these persons are problematic, but we should also understand that there are persons who are in bureaucratic positions in government who create the permanent government. It doesn't matter whether it's one president or another. These people stay around and stay around and stay around and execute their agendas, regardless of who's at the title, who's at the titular head of the government. And they've been doing this, at least according to Smedley Butler, since 1904. What's also yes.
And these people who create because I hate the term deep state. I don't know why I do. I just hate it. But because I think I don't like the term deep state, because it implies that there is a secret cabal of shadowy figures in the background that nobody knows about, and that's not true. These people have been doing this stuff out in the open. I mean, for at least, as Smedley Butler pointed out, at least 100 years, and I think we know longer. But the question I was going to ask you, but these people are not elected, are they?
Oh no, they are appointed under dubious circumstances, and that once they get into office, they groom their successors, and they continue with that process. When President Eisenhower warned of the military industrial complex, He was, of course, a 5-star
General.
Army general.
Right.
So he knew where the bodies were buried. He wasn't just talking off the top of his head. This wasn't conspiracy theory. And he understood that the danger that that organization, that those organizational processes of military, industrial, um, congressional complex, and that these folks stay around for a long time. They have their agendas. For example, Smedley Butler was recruited in 1934 to engage in a coup against the Roosevelt administration. Now, there were prominent, wealthy folks, not billionaires then, but equivalent to billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
The DuPonts, the Rockefellers, and the Brown Brothers, the organization, the banking group of the Brown Brothers. Now, the Brown Brothers, their name is Brown, but they bought in a man and made him a partner named Prescott Bush.
Oh.
Prescott Bush is George Bush's, George the First's father, George the Second's grandfather. And these are persons who engaged in, intended to engage in overthrowing this government. And Smedley Butler, unearthed that conspiracy. These folks have not gone away. They are still here. So George the First becomes the director of the CIA after Allen Dulles is fired sometime, but still in that succession, is fired by Kennedy for Kennedy's realization that these folks were out of control, and he needed to fire Allen Dulles, but it didn't make them go away. They still have stayed around. They are a permanent government, and the presidents and even people from Congress come and go, but they stay around because they represent the interests of the wealthy. And as long as the wealthy maintain their money, they still have that same power and that same agenda.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have to tell you, Dr. Tauheed, I love comments like this in conversations like this. I love it. It looks so simple and innocuous, but when somebody hears us talk about these connected tissue issues, and we know these people's, we know their exploits and their names in an isolated, unconnected kind of way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we start to connect all of these people to all of these events, to all of these issues, and then here we are still dealing with their progeny in the highest offices of government publicly, and the rest of their progeny are still pulling the strings for the permanent government in the background. When people say, "Oh, wow, I got it," oh, that's exciting, because now I think we've got another person who can be recruited in this fight to dismantle this whole system. But we have a lot of work, education, propaganda, and all that kind of stuff to get there. So what's the first step for us now?
Well, we talked about this in a number of times before, and the answer that I always give is organizing. Now, look, the wealthy don't really have to organize.
Thank you.
I mean, they don't have to go out in public to organize. They create institutions, corporations, think tanks. They hire people into these processes to carry on their agendas. And the people that they hire to work in these, they come and go. They work for the Heritage Foundation. They work for them, their careers. They retire, they go on, and then other people are stepping in their place and continuing the process on. We don't do that. We don't have these perpetual institutions where we can transfer this knowledge of how the world works to the next generation, and not only transfer how they work, but also transfer the lessons of how things could have been different.
Right.
And so you have to learn from your failures as well as your successes. And these think tanks do that. So they have what we call institutional knowledge, and we don't maintain that institutional knowledge from generation to generation. And so we are in the process. When I say we, I mean those who are opposed to oppression. I'll put it that way.
Right.
We have to start all over again. Every generation starts all over again, and many times falls into the same traps and that the previous generations are. I grew up in the 60s, little young in the 60s, but still grew up in the 60s, right? And what's happening now among protesters, for example, pro-Palestinian protesters, protesting genocide, certainly reminds me of that spirit. Although one analyst on a show, I won't mention the name, but a former CIA employee who was a high-level analyst who is now exposing things, if you will, said that one of the differences between the 60s and now is that in the 60s, many people who were protesting, let's say the Vietnam War, particularly men, had self-interest in that because of the draft.
Right.
And these young people now who are protesting genocide, there's nothing personally in it for many of them. I mean, if you're Palestinian and your family is being killed, that's personally there. And we have Jewish protesters who could just stand on the sideline and allow it to happen. There's nothing. They will be damaged by this process. There's nothing personally in it. They are in it for other people, and that's a difference. That's a good thing. But if we were to have a success here, then that mobilizing goes away, and organizing doesn't continue. We organize as we mobilize, and we need to organize and maintain permanent organization so that mobilizing becomes easy.
It sounds so wonderful and logical when somebody else says it. Because I swear, I'm beginning to think it sounds like Klingon or nail scratching on a chalkboard. When I say it, people get tired of hearing me say it, but this is really the truth. This is why this history is so important. We're not just talking about stuff that was done in the past. When I'm glad Leah said this in the comments, that Daruba Ben Wahad says we're fighting some battles we've already won. And that's what Dr. Tauheed just said is exactly why Daruba says that, because we have not transferred that institutional knowledge of how we won. Like a really simple example I always use is when people talk about boycotts, they always want to boycott something. They just want, and they think that a boycott is like a fast, easy, quick thing. And you just put information out there. This company is terrible for whatever terrible thing. Let's boycott. And then when people don't boycott, then people get upset. It's like, well, this is why Africans can't stand together and they don't want to do anything, blah, blah, blah. But where was the institutional knowledge about how the Montgomery bus boycott was able to be successful?
Right.
Why did it work? More importantly, how was it organized? Because if we look at how it was organized, how long it took to organize the Montgomery bus boycott, how many organizations and people, including churches and other civic organizations, were involved, the youth who were involved and engaged and took a lot of leadership, the white allies who were involved in the role they were willing to be told to play. Like, okay, it's great that you want to help, but you don't need to be in the meeting. We'll call you when we need you, and just be ready. Click. And that's, we don't know these things. So people can say things. Very often when I talk to people, they say, well, look, we can just boycott Pepsi like we did the Montgomery bus boycott. And when I say, okay, how many meetings are you going to schedule in these different organizations in your community to educate people about why they need to boycott Pepsi.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm not doing all that. Oh, you're not? So how do you figure you're going to get people interested in a boycott if you don't tell them why? So that there this what you just said about the not transferring institutional knowledge from one generation to another has been a point I've been trying to make in a ham-fisted way for years. Yeah, and I think many of us, many radical African organizers, activists, whatever you want to call us, we have been making this point that yes, we recognize there have been mistakes made in the past, but the reason we don't know that and the reason we keep making the same mistakes is because we haven't transferred that knowledge.
Right.
And this moment, I think, presents us with the reality that I think in this moment, there is no better time for us to do differently because we have social media now.
Right.
And even in the most tenuous kind of way, right? Because social media is not controlled by us. We don't control what actually gets seen by, our channels are throttled, and yeah, all of that stuff is true. Yes, we are surveilled on these platforms, we absolutely are. And yeah, all of that is true, but it is easier today to
Yeah.
spread information than it was back then. And even in that instance, people just don't want to do the work that we keep telling them needs to be done for us to finally deal with this system that is the problem.
Mhm. And I think part of the problem of not getting people to do the work is that we I think we don't realize that we can't. No one can do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to have what in economics we call the division of labor. People have to be able to do the things that they do best, but not have to spend their whole life doing that, particularly if they've got a family, they've got a job, they've got other obligations. So we have to do everything, but we can't have a few people doing everything. And so part of that organizing is to find people who have expertise in a few things, one thing, and say, we want you to do this for a couple of hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
And this so that we can so that people can live their lives, because quite frankly, if you are the wealthy, if you're in that wealthy class, you don't have to worry about your day-to-day things. You can hire somebody to take care of your children,
Mm-hmm.
and go to the grocery store for you, or actually cook, not go to grocery, because it's not like you're going to cook, and cook for you, or you eat out and so forth. You don't have those regular things to do,
Right.
but we do.
Right. Yeah.
And-
I see you coming for me, DC Joe Black. I can't look. I'm a type A organizer. I'm sorry. I know it's not healthy for me, but I'm trying. I'm trying to delegate. I'm doing better. So, okay, back to United Fruit Company,
Right.
because the economics of food,
Yeah.
just food in general, because we all have to eat. And I
Mhm.
don't care what you eat, but we all have to eat something, right? So food is a life staple, and it is something that we need to be able to afford so that we can live, not starve to death.
Mhm.
But when we're talking about the colonization of food in not just a capitalist environment, but an imperialist environment, what does that mean for the economic, the material conditions of particularly and specifically working class and poor people who have to now pay for food that is not indigenous to where they live,
Mhm.
that's that has to be imported, that their society is telling them, not only do you want this because it's delicious and it's exotic, look at this weird shaped little fruit that we don't know what it is, and but it's delicious. And then they have this this nutrition campaign. Oh, if you drink a glass of milk a day, your bones will be strong, and nobody was drinking cow's milk like that. If you eat a banana a day, it's a perfect accompaniment for your meals, and it's full of potassium. And all of a sudden you've got a whole country of people, 300 some million people now, believing that cow's milk is the standard of nutrition and bananas are everybody's favorite breakfast food without knowing the bloodthirsty history behind how they became staples, but also the economic impact it has on the indigenous communities where these products are commodified, but the benefits are not, they don't trickle down to the places and the people where these products come from. Explain how all this fits together for us.
Well, let's start with a discussion of the economics of colonization by starting with an understanding of what colonization means from an economic perspective. Okay, so you have a country, two countries. You have one colony and you have a colonizer, and there is an economic relationship between those countries. And the economic relationship for the colony is that the colony is going to be employed. I'll use that term, employed, maybe forced to be employed, but employed to produce a product, what we call a primary good, something like, something that comes from the ground. A food or some mineral or some forestry, some wood from the forest, something that is a primary good that grows out of the ground or comes. Okay, and so that country is going to be put to work providing that primary good, and that primary good is going to go over to the colonizer as an input to a manufacturing process, right? Or a transportation process. So, for example, bananas from Colombia, from Guatemala, comes into the U.S. And the banana itself is not going to be processed very much. Other things might be processed, like sugar cane would be processed into sugar. But it's not going to be processed, but it is going to go through a process where there's, quote, additional cost. I was going to say value added because that's the term that's used, but I'll just say cost.
Okay.
Additional cost is put on it. In other words, a banana that that the peasant farmer would get a penny for is going to be transported and is going to be sold for $1, right? That 99% additional value goes to the colonizer, not to the colony. And so the colonizer's products, whether it's food or minerals or oil or some forest, some wood and so forth, is going to be paid for very cheaply. And it's going to come into the colonizer, and the cost is going to be raised to create great profitability for the colonizer. And so we have these primary goods turned into finished goods, and then they're sold to persons who are in the colonizer country, who think of it as exotic. It must be expensive because it's something new. You mentioned De Beers, and you mentioned diamonds. Diamond is a primary good. It comes from the ground, and those who are mining the diamonds, the persons who are working in the mine, they're being paid a pittance of what eventually is going to be the cost of that diamond. It's going to be polished and cut a bit. But eventually it's going to be an exorbitant price. I used the diamond example in some of my economics classes because Adam Smith talked about diamonds. He has an example that's become known as the water diamond paradox. And the paradox is this: you would think that things that have a high value would have a high cost, and things that have a low value would have a low cost. Okay, so Smith says, look, water has a high cost, have high value, but it has a low cost relative to diamonds. Diamonds have, in Smith's time, low value. Now we understand what Smith is talking about is the industrial use of diamonds. He's not talking about the jewelry use of diamonds.
Right.
The industrial use of diamonds. Diamonds are plentiful. One, relatively plentiful. And when they're used in the industrial process, they don't wear out. They're used to cut glass and other kinds of things to grind stuff, and they're cheap.
Mm-hmm.
But when they become jewelry quality, and when the advertising comes that says that you must spend 3 months or 6 months or 9 months of your salary buying a diamond for your fiance, when of course that what was unheard of before, then you get people into a process of believing that these diamonds that are, water is, you need water for life. You don't need diamonds to live.
Nope.
But water is much more expensive now, at least is much more valuable. But until now is relatively inexpensive. I say until now because
Mm-hmm.
the price of water is going up.
Right.
But what makes the price of the diamond go up is advertising.
Mm-hmm.
It is convincing people that they must particularly, and it's not just the women who are convinced that the man is.
Uh-oh. We lost Dr. Tauheed for a second. He's having a little bit of an issue with his connection, but he is trying to hop back on, and we'll have him back on in a minute. But I'm so glad to be able to get back to these conversations with Dr. Tauheed, because we are in the middle. We are in scoundrel time, y'all. We are in scoundrel time. And people not recognizing the seriousness of the moment we are in are going to be caught unawares and surprised and in the wrong place in the wrong time, surrounded by the wrong people when stuff hits the fan in this country, which there is no way you cannot see the way things are going around the world, the multipolarity that is emerging, the the crumbling of the not just the infrastructure in this country, but pretty much everything. Everything is being exposed for the farce that it is, and we need these conversations in this time so we can ground ourselves in the reality of our material conditions, so we can connect them to the material conditions of our brothers and sisters who are struggling around the world, so that we can improve everybody's material conditions and understand that this is not going to be done through pleasant negotiations and sending gift cards. And no, this is the struggle. We wouldn't call it a struggle if it were easy. It really is a struggle, and we have to get out of being afraid to struggle, because, well, what did Chairman say? What did Chairman Fred say? If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. But if you are not going to struggle, you don't deserve to win. I don't know what else to say to you. So sorry we lost you for a second there, Dr. Tauheed.
Yeah, I
But
do. It switched to a different camera, but that's okay. I guess I can continue talking. What I was I think what I was saying was that about Smith, that he recognized that the value of diamonds and the value of water were inverse to their value, and that became a paradox. That you had to explain, why are diamonds so expensive? Now, standard economics has an explanation for it. I won't go into that. The explanation that we've been talking about is because De Beers says it's expensive,
pretty much.
And has convinced not just women but men that the men are deadbeats if they don't spend their house down payment on a diamond. And this is something that goes from generation to generation, because there's a process of advertising that does this from generation to generation. And so we these are little things, in a sense, that we have to re-educate people on, in an idea. If you got $40,000, you can spend it on a diamond, or you can put a down payment on a house. Which one do you think is going to continue to build your wealth?
Mm-hmm.
And it's financial management in that sense that we have to become part of the institutionalized process. But also, it's also a matter of getting off of the hamster wheel, if you will, so that you don't have to spend all of your waking time trying to earn a living. You can actually get involved in some organizing because you have some time to do that. And so organizing is back to that, important from generation to generation. And passing down that institutional knowledge means we have to also have some financial stability in our lives. I mean, at some point, Karl Marx said, you have nothing to lose but your chains. If that's all you have, then truly you have nothing to lose but your chains.
Right.
And now back to the idea of colonies. And so these countries that were colonized were put into a process of primary goods production for the colonizer. Now think about it. The indigenous people in these countries have been providing food, clothing, and shelter for themselves forever. Right? They're alive, so they know how to produce food for themselves. But when they're colonized, they're now no longer allowed to produce the food that they know how to produce because the land is taken over by these plantations, right? And so what they have to do is to take the meager earnings that they get from producing these primary goods for the North and begin to import food from other places that they have to, in order to be able to feed themselves and their families. So you have many countries that are producers, net producers and exporters of agricultural products that are also importers of other products. Instead of being able to concentrate on producing their own food, they have to produce food for other people and then take those pennies and buy whatever they can as imports. Now, no country and no people in the country would do that except under coercion. Right. And so they have to be coerced to become primary goods producers. And then there's also the carrot that's put out there. It says if you produce these primary goods and you accumulate some money, the government can tax that and can accumulate some money, then they can use that to buy industrial machinery, because everybody knows that what economic development is about industrialization. And so these countries begin to spend their meager income on buying industrial products, which is good for the industrial manufacturers, but never ends up being good for the colony. They can never actually benefit. And this type of analysis became aware among economists in the 1950s, particularly the South American economists who created a school called the Dependency School in Economics, realizing that these colonies had become dependent on the colonizer and would never be able to grow economically if they maintained that relationship. And so they began to try to cut that relationship and to not become producers of bananas and sugarcane and pineapple and these other primary goods, to go back to their own production. And they were met by military force to stop that from happening.
And in the case of United Fruit Company in particular, they started that process with Smedley Butler, and he admitted it.
Yes.
He said he started the process in he cleared Guatemala for United Fruit Company. What do you think cleared means? When he said he cleared Guatemala and he cleansed, that was the word I think he used, Nicaragua, for another entity. He murdered people.
Yeah, and he admits that.
He murdered people who opposed them.
Right.
Plain and simple. So the bananas we eat, and I'm on this quest now because I'm like, I love bananas. I love plantains, but I don't want to buy another Chiquita banana for the rest of my life. So where else can I get bananas? Right? What other brands of bananas are out there? And then when you start researching and looking, see, this has gone on for so long and we have not been able to make these connections. for various reasons. One of them being we didn't pass this institutional knowledge down. It's wild, though, Dr. Tauheed, that I was thinking the other day that, I'm sitting here doing all of this, looking up all this stuff online, and I can get it, that quick. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, no, you had to go to the library and you had to, know the name of the book and the author and look up the ISDN number. And y'all don't even know what an ISDN number is today. And do all of that. Research was labor intensive, just for regular folks to want to know stuff, not even for a dissertation or something like that. Today, all of that information that we were looking for back then that had all of this information, all of these facts, it's right here at our fingertips. It's right literally in our pockets and in our purses. Yeah. And still, people will not avail themselves to just read, beloveds. But that's why I do these shows. Because we can't make people read if they don't want to read. So I guess we can tell them about these things. Well, so maybe they get curious and maybe then they'll go read.
Yeah. One of the things that I do in my classes is, there are a lot of teachers, a lot of professors who will tell their students, turn off your computers and I don't want to see you on your phone and so forth. That's in some sense a losing battle. Because these young folks are going to be on their phones and so forth, they'll sneak it and so forth. So what I do is when I ask a question and I don't get an answer, I say, look it up. Go on your phone and look up the answer. It's there. You'll find it. Just Google this, And I want my students to know that there's knowledge out there in the world that you can get. It's right at your fingertips, as you say. And you don't have to not know things. And I'm not going to allow you to just say, I don't know, look it up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, that's a truly a tool that can be used to shortcut the process of this institutional knowledge and to help our organizing process. And yes, it is a tool that is used for organizing with these flash meetings and other kind of things that people do. But it's almost become where someone wants to do something. They want to bring a group of people together. They'll go on their phone and they'll put out on the flash agenda and people will show up. That's really mobilization because they show up, they do the protest, they do the thing, and then after that, they leave.
They leave and they never talk to each other again. Yeah. Nothing is established. There's no follow-up. There's no exchange of ideas. Nobody leaves knowing anything that they didn't know when they came. Yes.
Yeah. And so we have to use. I mean, the technology allows us to organize, and I think we have to use it better. Mm-hmm. The old organizers. Those who've been around for a while could possibly learn something from some of the young folks and have a transfer of knowledge back and forth. So the younger persons know that organizing is not just mobilizing in a minute and going away. You have to create some institutional process where people can stay together and talk about things and so forth. And work out agendas and pass on lessons learned. One of the things that was really disappointing and scary, in a sense, I'm looking at, for example, the George Floyd protests and other things that were before that. And you had among those protesters, you had obvious agent provocateurs.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, like I said, I grew up in the 60s and I was not a victim of COINTELPRO, but almost. Mm-hmm. But almost. And you might get the impression that COINTELPRO, once it was exposed in '74, disappeared. It didn't disappear. It's still in operation. And so when you have persons in, I remember the Floyd, the protests. Was it Floyd? It might have been Michael Brown. Might have been St. Louis.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Where you had the guy who was going back, he was marching, and he was taking a hammer and breaking windows and so forth.
Yeah, that was Mike Brown.
I think that was Mike Brown's situation. It was it was obvious to me that this was an agent provocateur.
Obviously, yeah. He's
Yeah,
got an umbrella. He's dressed head to toe in black, and he's just
yeah,
walking
yeah,
down the street with a hammer breaking. Well, come on now.
yeah,
That's
and being prepared for that kind of stuff means
Mhm.
that you don't fall for that trap. Right?
Exactly. So what I was starting to say before I diverted myself to another, which I do all the time. So I started to say the thing I did when I made these connections with United Fruit and Chiquita and the bananas, and understanding that Chiquita doesn't just do bananas, fruit, canned fruit. If you buy canned fruit, you're probably, and it's not a store brand, you're probably buying it from Chiquita, but even if it is a store brand, you're probably buying it from Chiquita.
Yeah.
So this is the question, and I think this is the conundrum where we are. When we hear information like this, the first thing we want to do is, of course, boycott. I don't want to buy any more Chiquita. That's awful. I didn't know that. Now I know. And then people go look for what banana brands can I buy that are not Chiquita, that are not owned by Chiquita brands, and they find none.
Mhm.
They find that Chiquita brands basically owns almost every company that imports, distributes, grows bananas and other fruit,
Mhm.
pineapple, and Dole pretty much has the market on pineapple still.
Right. Right.
But Chiquita, yeah. So if you want a banana that's not owned by Chiquita brands, you had better be talking to an independent banana farmer, basically,
Somewhere.
wherein lies the other problem at the end of this issue for people. Because now we don't have access to goods and materials that are not tainted with the stain of colonialism, right?
Yeah, I mean, the United Fruit owns the land, and bananas are only able to grow in certain places. You have to have volcanic soil to grow bananas, and so there are only certain places in the Caribbean and in South America and so forth, in the tropical regions, where you're going to grow bananas. So one solution to colonization of food in general is local production,
Mhm.
right? And there are movements for that in terms of community farming and so forth and so on. But you're not going to be able to grow bananas in Washington D.C. They're just
Nope.
not going to grow there. So you
I
have to.
tried. I know.
Okay, okay.
I
And
stood over that thing for like it's hot enough. Come on, it's sweltering. What's the matter with you?
yeah. So we have to have a different orientation to the type of foods that we're going to eat, and not allow the advertisers to convince us that we must have a banana every morning. You know.
Mhm.
So that's quite a learning process, an educational process, and an organizing process for communities to get back to a local food. But there is a local foods movement that our communities need to obviously participate in. And one of the problems in Kansas City here, we have lots of vacant lots in the Black community, right?
Mhm.
And one of the problems with many of these vacant lots is that they were former industrial landfill sites and other kinds of
Mm.
dumping sites and so forth. And so there's a whole process of needing to clean up the soil
Right.
in these places before you can actually do farming to grow good food and so forth. But we have to take on that challenge of doing that. And then
Mhm.
there's agroponics. There's other ways of growing food. And so now, one of the things that I talk about frequently is the inflation, the cost of food
Mhm.
going up. And part of the reason that the cost of food is going up is because of climate crisis. And so if you have lots of food that's being grown in other places in the world, in tropical areas, in the Caribbean and in South America, and they are being inundated by climate crisis issues and so forth, then the food supply from those places is going to be less available, and prices of food are going to go up, which is another reason to begin to grow local food.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the picture I showed a few minutes ago, and I'll pop it back up again. This is what my late husband Abdus and I called our revolutionary garden. This is I had a little garden plot in the backyard for years, and when I got married, Abdus, he was from New Jersey, he was from Camden. The closest he got to a garden, he said he used to pick blueberries on the farm bus when he was a little kid to go earn money, but he would end up eating more blueberries than he paid them. So he never made much money. So he didn't know anything about gardening. You know, we get married, and the first summer that we after we were married, I'm in the Home Depot and Lowe's getting on my garden and stuff. And he's like, "What is the matter with you? You were a whole different person. Why do we have all this dirt?" And I'm like, I garden. I told you I garden. He did not understand that I'm serious. So he's like, well, so when we did it put the garden in the backyard, and he's like, well, that's very nice, having the food and everything, being able to literally being able to go outside, and if you want a sandwich, you go outside and you pick a tomato, you pick some lettuce, and and it's great. You want greens for dinner, you go outside, pick the greens. And he said, well, why do you only do it in the backyard though? Why do you only have the garden in the backyard? And I thought, well, maybe the neighbors wouldn't like. And he's like, I don't care what the neighbors say. He's like, don't you pay for that? Isn't that your yard? Is that yard not a part of the mortgage that you pay? And I'm like, yeah, it is. You know what? You got a good point. So we decided to put the garden in the front yard. And to take up most of the lawn. And this year, I'm going to try to get rid of the rest of the lawn because I hate lawns. They're useless land to me. So this is my little revolutionary garden. I can't tell you how big it is anymore. But here's the thing: as nice as that is, here's the other economic reality of the economics of food. Because a lot of people who garden say things like, look, you can grow your own food and all you need is, listen, I'm a pretty medium level serious gardener, right? I spend, to start my garden in the spring, I spend a good $200-300. And that's on soil. And, whatever tools I need if I need to replace a board or something like that. But because I live in the city, in a development like this, there is not like 6 inches of good topsoil.
Right.
It's 3 inches of dirt, and everything else is concrete, bricks, glass, construction waste, basically.
Right.
If you're in the South or in a more rural area where you can dig right into the ground, that's fantastic. You don't need any soil. You got dirt. But if you're in the city, and what you talked about, Dr. Tauheed, about the process of cleaning up these vacant lots, not only is that process labor intensive, it is expensive. And when you're talking about cleaning up toxic waste, it requires expertise, which means it requires more money. But even on a personal level, if an individual just wants to start growing their, a few tomato plants, green peppers, some lettuce, just to be able to do it, I always caution people, look, I'm not going to tell you that all you need to do is this, because listen, you need to go out and buy or procure the containers for your container garden. You need to have good soil. You just can't go downstairs and dig around the tree, in the courtyard of your building, because I tell you that soil is garbage. You're gonna have to buy good soil. You have to buy the seeds, because people don't know that if you buy vegetables and fruit from the grocery store and you take the seed out, and you stick it in the ground, it will produce a plant. Most likely it will produce a plant, but most likely it will not produce fruit, because the vegetables have been irradiated so that the seeds don't reproduce. What does that mean? That means you can't go to the grocery store, buy green peppers on sale, and plant a whole pallet of green peppers that you can live off of and also use as income for yourself, because the seed companies, which are mostly owned by Monsanto now, unless you are buying heirloom seeds from these specialized heirloom seed companies, or if you are a member of a seed bank, right? The seed companies don't want you to grow your own vegetable, your own food from the seeds that are in the food you buy. The fruit and vegetable companies don't want you growing your own food from the seeds in the food you buy from the grocery store. And then your city council doesn't want you doing it, right? Because in a lot of places, there are restrictions on what kind of garden you can have, if you can put it in the front or the back. And if you want like chickens, like we wanted chickens, we have to get the approval of our neighbors to have chickens. So we knew that wasn't going to happen. So we're like, well, no fresh eggs for us, you know. But if you want to become more self-sufficient in growing your own food, that requires resources that we also don't have a lot of. And we do have a growing urban farming movement, a growing agriculture, local agriculture movement, but it's still small. And the issue of the economic and material conditions of our people being just in tatters really just makes self-sustainability in regard to food production incredibly difficult for us.
And it's not accidental that it's incredibly difficult. And you've laid out all of the agenda, if you will, for large food companies to make sure that we have to continue to buy from them as opposed to producing our own. And so, yeah, this is also part of the process of colonization, if you will, in the sense that the colonies, the producers of these foods, the farmers, get paid very little. And if we interrupt that process, then these Chiquita and United Fruit Companies and Dole and all these, they don't make their profit as well. And I'm sure the persons here listening have some knowledge of the destruction of Black farming in this country, the deliberate process, and the complicity of the U.S. government in that process. Not just corporations, but U.S. government being complicit in the process of the destruction of the Black farming process.
No, please talk about that a little bit. I know we're running over time a little bit, but I really want people to understand why, like, for us, and when you grow up in the South on a farm, you, like I did, I grew up with my grandparents had a little subsistence farm, you know, where it had maybe a quarter acre of land, and half of that was the farm, you know, or the garden rather. And that's how we ate. We ate a lot of tomato soup. We or vegetable soup and biscuits, beans and biscuits, you know, because you can grow those, right? And my grandmother and grandfather had chickens. We had cows at one point. We had pigs at one point. And as they got older, they just stopped doing a lot of that, the labor intensive stuff. But, you know, we grew up with the neighborhood or the family members coming together to slaughter one of the livestock, and the members of the community bidding on and buying a section of the livestock, right? And this was a community thing. This was not, we're going down to the local Smithfield plant, which is not far from where my hometown is. You know, these were Black folks, and everyone I knew had a garden. Everyone I knew had a garden, because we were Black in a white town in the South that was run by the Klan, and won't nobody feeling like going to the grocery store every time they needed something to deal with the white people. So they just rather grow their, you know, because we don't understand though what you said, the role the government had in taking away the ability of Black people to obtain and keep and hold on to and pass down their land, and what that has done to our ability to do exactly what we're talking about, sustain ourselves.
Yeah, and not an area of expertise of mine. I know a little, but if I would suggest that the conversation on this, that you invite a colleague of mine, Jessica Gordon Nimhart,
Mm-hmm.
onto this program to talk about. She is very much an expert in this in Black farming and farming cooperatives and the history of Black farming. There are about 2% of farmers now are Black farmers, or 2% of the farmers are Black, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that we're down to 2% of farmers when the numbers were much higher. I don't know exactly, obviously, in the 20th century. And part of the process, I mean, one of the things that farmers do is, farming is very much affected by weather conditions, right?
Yes.
In some years, you can have a bumper crop, you can have lots of production, everything works and so forth, and you can make a profit, and in some years you can't. And so farmers are the farming industry is dependent on loans to carry farms through those lean times, right? And so they'll go borrow money to take them through a lean year after they've not had a good crop, and then when the weather gets better, then they can pay that loan back
Right.
going forward. And so farming is a business, obviously, that's dependent upon being able to finance yourself through these processes. Now, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has farm loan programs
Mm-hmm.
where farmers can borrow money from the federal government at a very low interest rate to be able to get themselves through these years. Well, the Department of Agriculture denied these loans to Black farmers.
No,
Yeah.
say it ain't so.
Yeah, and have been sued. The Department of
Mm-hmm.
Agriculture has been sued because of their complicity in driving Black farmers out of business because Black farmers could not get loans. They couldn't get commercial loans.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So so they also then couldn't get loans from the federal government, the USDA. It was part of policy not to give loans to Black farmers. There have been suits, and some farmers have won, but not very many
Mm-hmm.
have won these lawsuits against the U.S. government. So it wasn't by accident that Black farmers were driven off of their farms. It was by government policy. This is obviously part of a reparations program
Mm-hmm.
that it needs to be part of that program because of the deliberate harm by the federal government to Black farmers. And of course, when those Black farmers were forced to sell their land, they would sell their land to white farmers who would then get a loan to continue the
Yep.
process, right?
Yep. And grow the land. Right.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, yes.
So you see there is no overstating how much of our material conditions, our deplorable material conditions, are a manufactured and intentionally sustained position that we are kept in. Like someone in the chat said that they live in a community with a bunch of Caribbean and other immigrants, and they've got chickens running all over the place. And they didn't know that you had to get approval to
Mhm.
have chickens in their neighborhoods. And see, this is the thing. When you have people who are from a culture and they're used to this and they all live in the same neighborhood, then they'll continue those practices in their new neighborhood because they have brought their community with them. And by and large, today, the US government pretty much leaves them alone.
Mhm.
Because, see, immigrants from African nations, this country doesn't mind. But us here, no, we can't do those things. So what we need to do, and this is what my late husband and I were talking about the chickens, because he was really upset we could not get chickens because that
Mhm.
man loved eggs. I mean, he was upset at how much we had to spend on eggs. And my answer was just like, well, if you wouldn't eat 3 of them every day, we'd probably have to. But he's like, I don't understand why we can't have chickens. I mean, we can have cats, dogs, birds, but we can't have, animals that we can get food from. I understand it's not a cow. I'm not asking for a cow, just some chickens, to produce some eggs, and we can share with the neighbors. And the conversation turned to how the government is complicit in using regulations that they frame as good for the community or the health of the neighborhood. And really what it does is keep people from being self-sufficient. The whole thing about lawns are actually not natural.
Right.
they're a creative thing, and they're a status symbol, actually.
Right.
The bigger and the greener your lawn, the more well off you are. And for me, the more butterflies and caterpillars and bees and critters you have, and if you're growing some herbs for medicine or food, or if you're growing food itself, that to me is a symbol of success. At least it's a symbol of a healthy attitude toward the environment, between the environment and yourself. And hopefully when people see it, it will spark interest, and maybe people will start replicating it, or at least, participating and trying to help. And these are conversations I think we have to have when we're talking about systemic change, revolution, and reparations, because those things are needed.
Yeah.
And the system is not going to change without those things.
Yeah, everything is not a life or death protest type of situation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, and so that's that nobody mobilizes for chickens,
I know exactly.
But
This upsets me.
if you organize folks and understand how this fits into, one of the good things perhaps of this inflation period where there's artificial inflation in rents, in housing, and food, is that people are more willing to listen to the idea that maybe we should grow some of this ourselves, and with in terms of housing and so forth, there's a lot of discussion about it was called affordable housing. But in terms of communities building housing that regular people can afford, instead of being at the mercy of the large real estate companies who are in collusion with each other to make sure that rents stay high, and are keeping houses off of the market to make sure that rents stay high, and so forth. And so there's a under these stressful conditions where things are just too expensive. Hopefully people can organize to address these issues, and these are just literally bread and butter issues, right?
Exactly. And unlike politicians who are always talking about, bread and butter issues with middle class people sitting around the kitchen table. No, this is not rhetoric for us. We are talking about how we are going to survive the collapse of this empire, because it's coming. It is absolutely coming. The question is, and we've been asking this question for well on now a year now. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when it happens? Because we know what the right wing is going to do. They are organizing for it already. What are we doing? That's my question that I we've been doing, these shows for a while, and I'm so happy that people have been watching us, Dr. Tauheed, and people have joined organizations. They've joined BAP, they've joined All African People's Revolutionary Party, they've joined other organizations, and many of them have said, because they have seen these shows and they appreciated the way we've made these connections, and it got them realizing, wait, they need to do more. And look, there are people who are doing this work, but still there's a part of this work that we miss, which is why I love these conversations so much, because that part of the work is, what are we going to do after the apocalypse, right? The empire is going to fall. What are we going to do to not just survive it, but to be the drivers of what kind of society will be built on the ashes of this one? And that is an incredibly important conversation that we can't miss in all of the romanticization of armed struggle, which some of us do sometimes, which is dangerous, right? Or the complete avoidance of any kind of struggle. And we're all going to have to eat, have clothes, have to live somewhere when the empire falls. How are you going to do it?
One of the things I would like to discuss in a future program is the idea of these digital currencies. There is the evidence is out with Nigeria, the country which became which went on a process of replacing its currency with a central bank digital currency, and it has led to a disaster in Nigeria. This for a number of reasons, digital currencies are not the way to go. Not only because it allows governments to surveil what you buy but also because they're not. So many people are unbanked, and so many people are. I mean, just to turn over all of your currency to a digital process means that others are in control of your money. I mean, you think you're having it at a bank, but you can't get to it without a card,
Right.
And so we should in the future. I'll do some more research, and we should have a discussion about that, because that is the part of the process of this place collapsing, going into a digital currency situation.
I mean, it's bad when currency that you can't put in your hand becomes mainstreamed and so much a part of the financial discussion of an alternative system to capitalism, that even the so-called leftists are talking about this fake currency being revolutionary, when most of the people who need a different system, as you pointed out, aren't banked.
Right.
So
Right.
couldn't participate in the system even if it were legitimate, which it is not. But
Yeah. And it's one thing to have a digital currency. We have debit cards and all that, but
sure.
it's one thing to only have a digital currency where you can't do anything other than through a banking system. With the banking system, I think about people who are saying that since the currency system is going to collapse, they're investing in gold. I do believe it is illegal for persons in this country to actually have gold. So
Really?
gold as a currency.
Gold bars?
Gold bars. So you can invest in gold, but that gold is in the control of a gold dealer.
Oh, wow.
And if currency were to disappear, how do you get to your gold?
Your dealer is not giving you your gold.
So that's not a solution. That's not a solution.
Wow.
We could talk about that at some point as well. It's these solutions to our problems that for me come out of corporate America are intended to do what corporate America does, which is to make profit for them. And we've talked about cryptocurrency and these other kinds of things that are very much showing that they are just mechanisms for making profits for the wealthy already.
Yeah, we definitely need to revisit that conversation with the new information, with the new evidence of cryptocurrency being the Ponzi scheme that Dr. Tauheed said it was last year. So be mad at Nigeria. Don't be mad at him, because he told the truth. So that's the show for tonight. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us for this double Lukman Nation double feature. So glad to have Dr. Tauheed back again. Looking forward to next time. As always, you all have a really, really good weekend. Next Saturday, yes, I'm advertising, and I don't have the graphic up because I'm a bad advertiser. But next Saturday in Washington D.C., come out to Black Liberation Media's Remix Morning Show All-Star Live event here in Washington D.C. Dr. Jared Ball, Kamal Franklin, Kim Brown, myself. Hopefully, Ricky Ryan will be with us. Ear Doctor. Um, all of us will be hanging out from 1 to 4 at 1301 Connecticut Avenue Northwest, I believe. I will drop the link later on so you can see it. But if you want to meet, come hug my neck, shake my hand, see that I'm still alive. I really am. You will come hang out with us next Saturday afternoon. Until then, be good to each other. Be really good to yourselves. Aluta continua. The struggle continues, but if we keep struggling, I promise you, Victoria Acerta. Thank you so much, y'all. Peace.